Okay, we're just setting up for week 8 today, so we'll see. Okay, just hanging out. Let's see, what are we doing? There is that. Because we know what happened on Monday when I tried this. It sort of all went kapooey. So today I'm gonna go do this early and see, and just to ensure everything is gonna work, but it seems like everything is working today. I know, what am I doing? The monitor is all the way over there and this camera's in front of my monitor. Oh, the things that we do. Oh, and we have a problem. Yes, we have a problem. Hey, Pam. Hi, Patty. So I tested this yesterday and everything just like popped up and started working like normal. And now that I'm ready to go live in 14 minutes, it stopped. So I'm trying to figure out, well, obviously Twitch works, but Facebook is not. So this is a problem. Oh, waiting for wine. Huh. Sounds like one of your favorite pastimes. Okay, I'm gonna move this camera over. I'll move it back here in a minute. But yes, I think she should share the wine. Always. Okay, on your cover, I don't see it. Oh, stop. A new tab. Date sale. More tools. Extensions. Their developer tools managed by okay. Request answer. Alright, update Google Chrome. You might see a pending update. Click relaunch. Huh. Do you see the panic? Where's their Facebook? Why? Oh. Sync Google. Chrome pictures and passwords. Clear browser settings. Open Chrome Store. I swear this is hell. Or should I say it's purgatory? What's the weather out there, Pam? It's like 65 degrees here. We just opened up the windows. All of the stores are closing? Are you saying your weather's better than mine? Okay. I'll be right back. So, babe, all of a sudden it failed again. My live. So it's the headset that's causing the conflict, so I'm not going to use the headset again. So the sound's going to be Hey, Shar. Okay, so won't be working with the headset today. Sound is gonna be funky, but you guys are on Twitch, so it doesn't matter. The other people on Facebook, I think they're gonna find it a little funky. So anyway, it gives me 3 minutes to solder a bunch of jump rings together to get ready for today's class when I was supposed to have, I don't know, a half an hour. Ay, ay, ay. How quickly can I make and solder jump rings, right? Yes, I believe I need wine right about now. Lordy. So I'm making a bunch of jump rings, bogus jump rings, to just daisy chain and solder together to make an example of what not to do. All right, 3 minutes. Yes, I'm leaving the camera up there for a little bit because I don't want to have to move it twice. Hi, Gail. One jump ring. Hey, Debbie. I'm prepping. I'm running a little behind because for everybody who's just getting here, technology has failed me again today, despite the fact that I fixed it yesterday. And I'm just throwing together, daisy chaining some jump rings to use as a sample today as to what happens when solder fails and how to fix it. Okay. It's Andy calling me. Hi, sweetie. Okay. I'm soldering one more jump ring and then I'm going to get Facebook running. Okie. I know, I have 1 minute. Okay. Sorry? Twitch is running. Hi, Jamie. Yeah, so sunny today. So excited. Okay. What's going to happen in the next 2 or 3 days? Is it really? So apparently it's supposed to rain and thunderstorm the next couple days. Andy's telling me I better get my hike in while I can. So I will do that. Okay, I'm going to be 1 minute late on Facebook. Actually, I'll just go ahead and do that online. Okay, so almost there. Can't see what I'm doing. If only y'all could see what I'm doing. Okay. Here we are. And start that. I need Twitch on my screen. filter. Okay, just about. Yes, I know, I just stood up. Oops. Okay. Oh, earrings from the book. All right, so going live on Facebook here. 3, 2. All right. Okay, are we here? Slightly off the camera there, but that's okay. You guys are gonna, get over it. It's been like totally crazy already this morning. Hi, it's Wednesday and we are on Facebook Live and Twitch. So, I obviously have angered the tech gods because on Monday, if you were here, you'd know that things were failing. So what did I do? I decided to take yesterday and decided to test the system, and I plugged everything in, and everything worked. It was great. I'm like, okay, it was a glitch. We're going with it. So today I decided to plug it in, thank goodness, a little early, 12:30, and it failed again. So no headset, which means the sound is going to be a little funky at some point for the Facebook people because the sound comes off of the camera. And I know from early on when we start doing this that every time I start torching, it does cut out. So I'm going to try to work with it, bear with me, and I'm going to see if I can try fixing this again. And Facebook just fell off. Okay, we're having trouble playing this video. Oh, Lordy. Totally just stopped. Honey, is Facebook still up and running? I have a black screen. That's why I'm asking. Okay, so Janet, if you can hear me, can you just verify that you can see something? Okay. I have a black screen telling me that it's not working. Literally, it says we're having trouble playing this video, which tells me it's not working. Okay, so I'm going to keep going until somebody says you've lost a connection. All right, so let's go ahead and work through a couple things here, and I'm just going to talk about a little superfluous stuff, and see how it goes. So a couple updates literally just happened today. Is Bead and Button registration opened yesterday, and I just found out today because I'm a little behind, but Bead and Button registration is officially open. If you are registered for the June classes, they have moved all of your registration over to August if you haven't canceled. So your space has been secured. If you want to register, obviously you can register. It is at the end of August, and we're all doing the fingers crossed thing that we're going to have a show. Who knows? We'll see how that goes. Anyway, so at least they're keeping a pretty liberal cancellation policy and working with the situation that is here. So the link is in the description of the Facebook Live video that we're doing today. The other thing is Gemorama. Tuscarora Lapidary Society has a Gemorama every year, and this year for the first time I will be teaching there, and I believe it's the first time that they're doing real classes, so instead of just demos. So I just posted registration for that also on the Urban Beater website, and I provided a link here. For classes at Gemorama, you will not be registering with them, but you'll be registering with me directly. So that's the story, okay? A couple of, I'm sorry, what was that, Andy? Okay. Oh, so Andy wanted me to also mention that we will be having a booth at the Gemorama too, along with the classroom, sort of like what we used to do at Bead Fest. So we're giving it a try, like I said, for the first time ever, and we're excited for that because it's all the way in November, and I'm really hoping everything dies out and we can get back to what we were doing before. What does it say about the videos? I don't know. We're still playing it by ear. It's still, for me, the next scheduled event is probably about a month out. So so I'm going to keep this up for a month, and if we do go to doing classes, I only have one thing at Stars Beats at the end of June, and then nothing in July. So we'll be doing this for a while. So at least, and I'm pretty sure that we're going to keep this up for quite a while, if not permanently, because I'm enjoying this, and I think some of you guys are enjoying it too. So if you are enjoying this, do know that all the videos at the end of every week I'm uploading to YouTube. So, and I know that it's a little bit easier to find the videos there than to dig through the Q Talk Facebook page, which is fine. So you can definitely subscribe there if you'd like. If you are looking for a little bit of better resolution for watching, you can do this on Twitch. I know that a bunch of you guys are on Twitch, and thank you for that. And if you have Amazon Prime, I would really appreciate it if you subscribed on the Twitch channel. Anyway, okay, so what are we doing today? Today we are doing what happens when solder fails, because this happens quite a bit. So I'm sorry, Andy. Oh, okay, I'm sorry. Somebody asked if there's a Bead Fest update. Nope, I got nothing, but I will tell you as soon as I know. You'll find it on my Facebook page as soon as I know anything from them, but we're all just holding out, and I think they're just sort of holding out too before making any kind of commitment. I know it's a little loosey-goosey. That's all I've got. Anyway, so back to soldering. What happens when solder fails? The thing is, before we talk about what happens when it fails, we sort of have to put everybody on the same page just a little bit, okay? A lot of what fails is that people don't see the nuances of the solder, seeing it when it flows, seeing the heat, understanding that they're heating too hot here and not hot enough there for the solder to flow. So that's the biggest thing that you need to remember, is that you've got to get everything hot evenly, and you got to get it to the right temperature. How do you know that you're getting it to the right temperature? You sort of don't. It's all a look and a feel. You got to just sort of watch it. And that's, you got to let the metal sort of tell you. And if it's not working, it's got to be one of those few things. Either the joint is dirty and the solder, there's interference to the solder, or there's not enough heat, or you're heating it improperly, meaning too hot in one place and not hot enough in another. So that's typically what the problems are. And I'm going to make a point here. I'm going to tell a quick story. A couple of years ago, I had this student who came to me through a resin class. I know, totally weird. Yes, I have taught resin. But because she knew me from there, she has been wanting to learn how to solder. That was her goal for the year. So she came to a class at Bead and Button, and she's legally blind. That's the story. So the thing is, bottom line to that story, if I can get somebody who's legally blind to solder, everybody can solder. That's the big story. But the thing is, how does she get there being legally blind when she couldn't even really see the torch? It was about a feel and a nuance. And believe it or not, she was not successful in finishing the project, but we knew that. We knew that was never going to happen in the 3 hours. She needed to successfully solder joints, and that was her goal. So by 2.5 hours, we finally put it together, and she figured out the nuance of it. And by the end of 3 hours, she was able to solder, even with her limited eyesight. So nuance counts. Another thing that you need to give yourself to is a little bit of time to give yourself muscle memory, okay? Because the muscle memory will kick in at some point. You're like, oh yeah, okay, it's long enough because I've heated it this long and it should have soldered. Whether or not you ever even see the solder flow, it is an assumption. And that's sort of how I can see from across the room. If you've been in a class with me, you've seen me do this, where I can see from across the room whether or not a piece has actually soldered. And people are just looking at me like, how do you see that? I'm like, go gadget eyes. Of course, what else would it be? No, actually, it's a feeling. I can tell, and I knew how long, and I can tell how far the torch hip is from the piece, and I know how big the piece is, so I can feel it, that it had to either have happened or it's sort of like gone awry. So there it is. That's the other thing. And lastly, the other thing I wanted to point out was about focus, okay? We talk a lot about seeing the solder flow, but if you're not looking in the right place, you'll never see it flow, and that's a problem. Because what happens when people do like this ring is you should be looking at everything, where people just focus in on the joint right there, and their eyes are just like hyper focused, and they don't see that other things are getting hot, and all of a sudden things are melting because you're not looking at the big picture. That's a problem. You gotta look at everything and where you are soldering. So don't be too hyper focused, but then don't be too, looking at too big of a picture. So that's the story there. Okay, so solder. What happened? I mean, why isn't it flowing? I've seen it. I've done it. You're heating the piece. You have the solder on there, and all of a sudden it just balls up into a granule, and it sits there, and nothing happens. It just sort of sits there, and you're heating it. You're heating it. You're heating it. Why? Well, maybe the joint's dirty. Okay, maybe there's no flux. You have to have flux for solder to flow. So perhaps you burned off all the flux. Perhaps the joint is dirty and it just doesn't want to go there. That's typically the problem. So remember, you have to have flux and you got to get it clean. So at that point, what do? Take the piece, pickle it, clean it however you need to clean it, and then try it again. A mistake here that a lot of people do is the solder is there. Okay, if the solder hasn't fallen off or gone somewhere else, if the solder is there, just put more flux on it. Don't put more solder, because if you put more solder on there, it's going to get really, shall we say, yucky. It's not neat. Okay, it just goes everywhere. So just put a little bit more flux back on. Okay, so if the joint is not, you've soldered, the solder has flowed, but the joint is not together, okay, why won't the joint stay together? Okay, so if the piece isn't touching and you have solder there, I mean, even that's really tiny, maybe you can't see it, but there's definitely a gap in there, and you've heated it, the solder has flowed, well, it didn't find itself. Because really, you should not use solder to fill a gap. And remember, if you're using solder paste, it has a really hard time bridging. So if you do need to solder a gap, you want to go to something like a wire solder. Okay, so that's typically the problem if the solder, the joint is not staying together, or you feel like it's breaking after you've soldered, is that there is a tiny little bit of a gap. Another problem too, why that even though the solder has flowed, but the joint is not staying together, is because maybe you heat it on one side more than the other, and the solder has flowed away from the joint and not bridging that gap. So that's why you have to heat evenly. Remember, a lot of what we're talking about here is about silver soldering, okay? So with silver soldering, you got to heat the whole thing evenly, and to get the solder to flow and get into that joint evenly. All right. Another problem is not enough solder. A lot of times beginners, they're having a hard time finding what is enough and what is too much. Too much is not necessarily a bad thing, it's just sloppy, okay? The problem with too little is it's not enough to bridge that gap or that joint to make the connection. Unfortunately, without standing there and looking at it, or a picture, if you have questions, you can always send me a picture, but without a picture, I can't tell you what the problem is, if it's too little or too much. What happens if you have too much? Well, if you have too much, a lot of times it just bleeds all over the place, and then, your chains are going to solder together, and it's no longer flowing. And I'm going to show you that here in a minute. So, all right. I'm going to go ahead. Those are the couple of things that I wanted to share and make sure that we were all on the same page on. And I'm going to show you a couple of things to do when the solder fails, and maybe you have soldered pieces together that shouldn't be together, how to take them apart and how to address it. Okay, give me a second. I'm going to move all the cameras, for both cameras, and then we'll get started. All right. Okay. So I'm going to need a little guidance from Andy. I cannot see on the monitor my Facebook camera at all. And then I'm going to switch this down and see if we can see that. Oops. Okay, there we go. And let me move this out. Okay, there we are. Okay, so because of my technical difficulties, I didn't get a chance to make this into a sample. All right. So what this is here, what I'm looking at is, this is a ring. I'm going to solder it, but I'm going to solder it off. All right. Let's see if you can see that on Twitch, that it is not together. And then let's see if you can see that on Facebook. Okay. So I'm going to solder it off because this happens a lot. And honestly, it happened to me the other day too. And the question is, how do you get it back together? Okay, just put a little bit of solder on there. Actually, this is a lot of solder. So I'm using this solder pick because I can. Let's see, and I'm going to move this out and get the white solder board so you can actually see what I am doing. Okay. All right, so I'm just going to solder this really quickly. No big deal. It's a really big jump ring of sorts, but I did it, I made a large ring so that you can actually see it on camera, what's going on. All right, so here, on Facebook, honey? Okay, so here you can see that my ring is slightly off, okay? It's not butted together like this, it's off like this, all right? So I'm gonna show you guys there on Twitch, okay? So that said, what most people would have done is most people would have cut this and then filed and resoldered it. But I'm going to do it the easy way. This isn't, well, easy for me. I'll say it like that. For some people, this is sort of hard, okay? But it does work, and it works especially well for smaller rings. And I do this all the time with jump rings when I solder it and it's slightly off. All I'm going to do is I'm going to heat this whole thing, and while it's hot, I'm actually going to push it down, okay? So again, I'm going to heat everything, get it nice and hot, and I'm going to get that solder to flow again. Sometimes you're going to need flux. Oops. Okay, I bent my solder pick. I'm going to do some, it's a really big piece of metal, so it needs something a little bit more stable than the solder pick. Jump ring would have been fine. Okay, so I didn't flux it because I'm using paste and it's a bit more forgiving, but sometimes you do need to add flux, so there it goes, and look at that. So when the solder flows, I'm pushing down the ends so that they come together, okay? Yep, look at that. So now the joint is together. I'm gonna show everybody out there on Twitch land too. Okay, so yeah, really simple instead of pulling it apart. If you cannot get that to happen, then yes, you will need to either cut it or saw it open and then try it again. Another thing you can do too is just sort of pry it apart while you're soldering. Okay. So here, if you have a jump ring, it's soldered. This is a very large ring, okay, from the other day, but it's soldered. For whatever reason, if you want to pull it apart because it's in the wrong place or it's all of a sudden overlapped, unless you have another person standing here, this is another way you can do it, okay? I'm putting it in a third hand. I'm going to heat the whole thing, and then I'm going to heat the joint, and I'm going to pull on it. There it is, until the solder releases. So as soon as the solder flows, I can pull it apart. Did you see that? Oops. Hold on. Don't go grabbing these hot parts here. Okay, so that's how you would pull it apart if it didn't work. All right. Okay, so that's another trick. Now, chains. Somebody had sent a question about their chain. They were soldering a pendant. They were soldering a chain onto a pendant, but the next thing you know, the chain had soldered to the bail. So how do you get that apart? Well, let's just go ahead and haphazardly solder this, all right? So this is just a couple of jump rings that I soldered together, and I'm now going to throw some solder on there. Let's see. And solder them like they shouldn't be soldered, okay? They should be moving, but I'm just gonna put solder all over the place. If that would actually happen for me. It's not sticking because it's wet. All right, so here's a trick. Since it's not sticking because it's wet, gonna heat it. Apply to dry it, and again, I'm just gonna throw some solder in there where it shouldn't be. Okay, and I'm gonna solder it. So this happens a lot when solder moves in the wrong place. And it moved to the wrong place more than likely because you overheat it somewhere along the line. And of course, when I want it to stick together, it doesn't. Try that again. Okay. Give it a second to set because it's copper. Okay, so you see that? These pieces should be flowing, right? Okay, so you see out there on Twitch, let's see, it's not really moving. There you go. So the pieces are stuck together, and there we are. So how do you pull this apart without cutting it? Because, you know, if you cut it, then you're basically starting over, but, you know, you want to maintain the integrity of some of this stuff. So how I do it is I just hold on to one of the pieces and I heat it. Okay, typically I'll do it over a bowl of water. If there's a piece that's hanging off, so to let it drop into something. But here they should all be chained together. So what happens is, notice I'm holding it up and I'm heating it, right? And I'm shaking it and heating it. And as soon as the solder starts flowing, it'll drop off. However, to the person who sent me the picture, your chain was so small that more than likely this will not work. Additionally, there was so much solder on there that the solder probably will not break apart like mine did, okay? So you have to sort of, it's a case-by-case process. So you have to sort of look at, you have to look at the piece and determine whether or not you're able to do that, okay? So the next thing that happens a lot is when people are soldering bezels to a back plate. Okay, so here this isn't a bezel, this is a very heavy ring, but we're going to pretend it's a bezel, and here is a back plate that I had already soldered. Actually, I demoed this a couple weeks ago on just some basic soldering stuff. So what has happened here is my solder had only gone through half of it, and it didn't go through the other half. So what do you do there? Well, it depends on your piece. You can ignore it because maybe you're going to put a decorative around it anyway. And if you're putting a piece of decorative wire around it, it doesn't matter. But if you do need that to fill, how do you do that? Apply more solder. However, two things. Applying more solder is great, but remember, sometimes it gets way too sloppy. So what do you do? What you want to do is you just want it to get it flowing again by adding more flux. So you need to look at it and see how much solder you already have on there. Otherwise, we're just going to put some solder on the inside of that, okay, and ask it to flow again. The problem that most people have at this point is usually when bezels don't stick to the back plate. That's a really, really common thing. Why? Why not? Okay. Because usually the back plate is heavier than the bezel and you're not getting the heat to distribute between the two pieces. Okay. Another thing too is if solder is just sort of sitting there and it won't flow, it's because you didn't get the, shall we call it, the base metal, the metal that you are trying to join. You didn't get that to the solder's melting temperature. You got to get that to the solder's melting temp, okay? A lot of times I get the question, well, how long do I need to heat it for? Well, the truth is if you're holding out your torch all the way out here for a long time, you can sit here all day long and it will never work. You just have to get it to that melting temp, whatever that is, because every metal has a different melting temp and so does the solder, okay? So when you're doing a bezel, if you're having a problem with the solder flowing, the bezel not connecting to the back plate, you have to look at it and determine, is there solder on your bezel or is there solder on your back plate? Where did it flow? If it flowed up to the bezel, that's because you're heating from the top and you didn't get the back plate hot enough. If the solder is flowed to the back plate, then you're heating underneath too long and you didn't get the bezel hot enough, okay? So here, I'm just gonna solder this area that didn't get soldered, but yet I have to heat the entire thing, okay? So I'm just gonna heat the top, get it nice and hot, and then I'm gonna go under, and I'm gonna heat from underneath. Okay, that's a problem. A little too close to the Facebook camera, sorry. Let's see if I can adjust it a little bit. Heat it here. Heat it nice and hot. This is a really heavy piece of metal I'm playing with today. So I'm going to get really hot underneath and I'm going to come right back up. I'm going to heat it on top and then it's going to flow. Notice I'm heating on the inside and on the outside, and there it goes. Done. Okay? And the solder went right around. So again, it's about making sure that the heat flows underneath and at the top. And then I get the complaint that, well, it soldered just fine until I put it into the pickle, and then it fell apart. So the thing is, it didn't. Obviously, if it fell apart on, if it fell apart in the pickle, it never did solder correctly. So do know that. Okay, you know what? I'm sort of struggling here with technology. Give me a second. I'm gonna try to pull up the Facebook screen because I know that I'm not on camera over there. So give me a second here. I literally have a black screen up on my side, so I can't see what I'm doing. Oh, you know, I love technology and yet I hate technology all at the same time. Okay. And you know, it's interesting. I can't see myself go live. That's so, oh, yes, I can. There it is. All right. So finally, I can see what's going on. All right. Thanks for your patience, everyone. It's just this technology thing is killing me. Okay. So here, back to what I was saying is people will tell me that, oh yeah, my bezel, it's soldered. It was just fine until I put it into the pickle and it fell apart. Again, if it fell apart, you didn't solder it. It wasn't fine. You just think it was fine. That's all. So it didn't quite happen. I'm sorry, Andy. Okay. Hold on, we're still struggling to get everybody in the same, oops, in the same place here. Okay. Okay, so the question is, what if you're soldering a really heavy piece of metal, say a ring, say a heavy ring shank, and the inside, the solder was fine and it flowed all the way through, but on the outside, it didn't. That means you didn't put enough solder in there. So go back and do it again, add more solder. But that's definitely lack of solder if it flowed all the way up. Okay, so here, what if this is bad? Like, meaning you want to take this apart. This is something that I think you should know how to do. Okay, so I'm going to hold on to this here and put it on a solder brick. These are the standing tweezers that, these are pretty cool. I like having these because they're cross-locking, and there's, believe it or not, 4 different heights. Every time you turn it, it's a different height. So it's nice to have, because some people find the third hand a little annoying. So here what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull this out, pull it off, because maybe you don't like this back plate anymore, or maybe it's soldered in the wrong place, or whatever it is, doesn't matter. I'm heating the whole thing. And just the same as when you're soldering on, when you're taking it off, you got to get everything hot just the same so that the solder flows. And potentially I need pickle here. I don't think I have enough pickle, or I'm sorry, flux. Okay, so I'm going to keep wiggling this. There it is. As soon as it flows, it falls out. I'm sorry, Andy. So the question is, where do I put solder? Inside or outside of a thick ring? It doesn't matter, because it still has to flow through regardless of what you're doing, right? So, which sort of brings me to what happened this week. I had a student contact me regarding a project. You want to talk about thick. She was using 16 gauge metal, which means I think that's a 1.8 millimeter thickness. This here is only 18 gauge. So she was using 16 gauge, and the solder flowed, I don't know. I believe she said 4 times, 5 times, and every time she put it on the mandrel, it broke. She couldn't get it to happen. Okay, so a couple things worth mentioning here is, first of all, sometimes solder just downright fails. It fails with me too, and I can't get it to happen. And sometimes, so what do? I pray, but typically I set it aside and I just walk away. And it just needs, I don't know, I feel like it's juju, and it just needs time to breathe. Okay, that you just need to take a time out and let it go. So when this student contacted me, I said, okay, let's do it together. And I swear, I don't think I did anything different, or I showed her anything different, or that she did anything different, but it just worked when she was on video chat with me. And, it's just a slightly different approach. So what we did was, she was using solder paste, which is fine. I use it, it works. And then so I decided, you know what, let's just change it up. Let's just use some wire solder. Why not? And sometimes you just have to do that for yourself, is to switch it up and try a different approach. It just wants that, and that's okay. All right. A story that I told her to make you guys feel better is that, you know, I was taking a class in Hong Kong, and that studio, it is a fine jeweler studio. Okay. They're doing some heavy duty stuff, and they don't use medium solder. I'm like, excuse me, why don't you use medium solder? Because none of us can get medium solder to work. I'm like, excuse me, what do you mean? There's a melting point to everything. We just can't get it to work, so we skip it. We just do hard and easy. So you see what I mean? There is a certain juju that happens out there to everyone. So you're not alone when this doesn't happen. Okay, so just step away, clean it, don't get too obsessive about it, and just let it sit and come back. I do that all the time when I have projects that fight me. All right, so even with the thick heavy gauge solder, it's just sometimes it's just hard. The heavier it is. Also understand that it has a lot to do with torch. We're using the butane torch, which means it doesn't get as hot as, say, an acetylene torch. So it's going to take a lot more heat to get your solder to flow. Okay, so another question I had earlier this week was, someone said, you know what, I get everything done. This was from what, last week we were sawing. I get everything done, and I get to that final part of putting on the bail, and disaster strikes. Okay, so I'm going to discuss that again. So here I have a bail on here. I'm going to take it off. All right, so I'm just going to stick it in here. I'm going to heat it. And when the solder flows, take the jump ring off the bail. And I'm going to show you how to put the bail back on and why it's not working for some people. Okay, take that off. I'm going to throw that in the pickle. To get this to solder again, I'm going to have to pickle that. Does anybody have any questions? You want to throw it out at me? See if I actually address it. Actually, you know, I'm going to put a bail on here. This is a really heavy piece, so why not? You should be able to see it better. So you've done all your work, and now you want to put a bail on it, and yet it just sort of wants to fall apart. Oh, here's a challenge. Why don't I just use this as a bail? Okay, oops. So again, a piece I made a couple weeks ago. Not exactly clean, but I'm going to throw it in the pickle, and we will use it again. Actually, wait. Going with the flow here. Okay. So here was the chain that I had earlier that was stuck together. What if I wanted to solder this on here? What's the best way to do it so that not everybody sticks? Well, there's a trick to that. Let's see. How do I want to do this? So I'm thinking, I'm doing this really on the fly and just, hey, look, there's a challenge. Let's try that. Okay. So what if I wanted to solder this piece on, I'd probably pull out two contraptions. I'm going to pull this one out to hold it here. Oops. Okay, so I'm using my cross-locking here, my standing tweezers to hold the jump ring. Okay, so note here, a lot of times when bails do not stick or solder to the piece is because there's a gap between the bail and the piece itself. So you got to make sure that you have made a connection there, right? So I'm going to move this and make sure that that bottom piece is actually touching the top piece. All right, I'm going to do that again. You can also use a third hand for this. All right, so now that it's touching, well, what about this? Okay, I know that you're going to be fearful that it's going to be touching. So this is going to be a little tricky, but this is where your tools come in. So whatever tools you have, I'm going to use a solder pick, but then I got to put some solder down first. So a little bit of solder. Do you have to put the solder in between? You know, I have a tendency not to put the solder in between. I put it on one side, especially on a bale. I put it on one side, so I'm putting it away from me because the torch is going to be in front of me, right? And I still don't have it touching. Okay, so I have the ring here. I have the standing tweezers holding my jump ring on it for the bale. The jump ring is actually touching the bottom piece. There is solder on the far side away from me, okay? And because I'm fearful that this jump ring, or I'm sorry, this chain of jump rings is going to solder down, I'm going to hold it off like so. If you have another pair of standing cross locking, you can lock it in there, or you can put your third hand and hold it there, right? So turn it on and it can heat. So here is where most people fail, okay? Is they're heating up here and they're heating the jump ring. There's no reason for that because there's so much residual heat that you should be getting that big piece underneath. That's got to get really nice and hot. See, the jump rings are going to get hot on their own. And so you see where I'm moving all around along the bottom and not even heating up on top, right? And even so, my jump rings are getting way hot, even though I'm not even pointing at them. And I'm just keeping that heat pointing down until it solders. Does that make sense? I hope it makes sense. Again, I always feel like I'm sitting here talking to myself. I sort of am. Okay, so my heat is pointing down at this piece the entire time. I'm moving around, but it's always pointing down. I never come up and heat the jump rings because they're going to get too hot. And remember, solder follows heat. So it's just going to run up there. So, you know, the person who asked before, this is where you always fail. I'm going to contend that the reason why it's failing is because you're heating in the wrong place, okay? That you're not heating the big piece. So whichever the piece is biggest, that's what you need to heat. But look at that. Nearly impossible piece to solder for what is seemingly impossible can be done. It's not a great joint, but it is a joint. See? And look, my, haha. And another point has been made. So my chain is now stuck. Hold on, Andy. So I got everything so hot that the solder has flowed, right? And my chain is no longer flowing. So now you're going to probably want to pull that apart. I'll show you how to do that. And I'm going to ask Andy what the question was again before I move on. So the question is, do you heat on the opposite side of where the solder is to draw the solder towards the flame? Yes. So what I did, again, is I put the solder on this side, right? And I heat it from this side. So it did pull through, okay? So here I have a jump ring, or shall we pretend it's a chain, and it's stuck. So how do I get that apart? You know what, before I do that, I'm going to go ahead and pickle this because it's really dirty. So I'm going to pickle that, and I'll throw on a little bit of Flux. You know, a lot of people don't keep Flux on their workbench because they're using solder paste, and solder paste has Flux already built into it, right? But sometimes when you have a situation like this, where's the Flux? You've already burnt it all off. So how are you going to get to flow again unless you have Flux and you put it back in? So that's why I keep Flux on my workbench. While that is pickling, I also want to mention I had a question come in today. Someone asked about solder paste drying up. And typically I would tell people just add flux to it. I mean, you should, well, idealistically just reconstitute, right? But then I decided to go ahead and Google it on and see what kind of answers came up there. And I wasn't really satisfied with what I was seeing. In fact, I thought it was sort of nuts what people were saying. I'm not even going to mention it because I don't want to confuse anybody. So I queried the manufacturer this morning and I said, hey, how do you reconstitute the solder paste? And the response was, you don't need to reconstitute it. It should never dry out. Oh, well, that's sort of interesting. So, and it also made the point to me that I have a tube of solder paste that I've had for 12 years that's never dried out. And I don't know, and I never knew why until today. But yet, what's interesting is I've had plenty of students tell me that their solder paste has dried out. So I don't know what the story is there, but their answer was, if it has dried out, cut off the tip to take that dried out part and pull the solder out and mix it again, and it should pull it all together. So that's the story I was given. And so I also queried him about what I read on the internet, and I have not heard back on that second query. So if I get an answer back, I will share that with everyone. All right, so here we are. We have rings that are soldered together accidentally because obviously it got really hot and the solder flowed and it jumped to where I didn't want it. So what I'm going to do, how I will do this, is I will hold the piece that is flowing, and you see here, this is the piece that's stuck, and I'm gonna hope that gravity takes over. See, I just have to look and figure out which way I want it to go. Gravity takes over and that it will fall off, okay? So I'm gonna put a little bit of flux on there. Okay, and I'm gonna heat it. I'm sorry, Andy? I'm thinking about that. Okay, so I'm just gonna heat it. I put some flux on there to help it move. And notice I'm shaking it to see if I can get that to move. And I'm not heating anything else except that area. Okay, so it's not gonna wanna move, which is fine. So now, again, I'm gonna pull out some extra instruments to help me. I don't want to grab that's hot. Okay. And I just want something that will brace this. Okay. So here I'm going to heat it and I'm going to help it by touching it. And I'm not just heating up because I don't want to heat the bail. I don't want to heat anything else. I want to try to direct my heat exactly where I want it. There it is, you see? And I just start touching it as I was heating it. I was touching it until it released, and look at that. It just released. Voila, yay. See? Okay, so someone just mentioned that apparently Rio had a bad run on solder and that everybody was asked to either exchange it or add flux to it. So sounds like the advice I sort of gave this morning was to add flux to it. Anyway, so I guess it does happen that solder does dry up, but it doesn't, or solder paste does dry up, but it doesn't sound like it is something that would happen typically. Frankly, so far we've not come across that that defect here. So, and I wonder if it was it was probably a different manufacturer, and so anyway, I'm pretty sure that the manufacturer that we use would have contacted us to let us know if there was a problem. Okay, so what else? Let me look at my list here, see if I got everything. Soldering a bail if it doesn't connect, pulling apart soldered pieces, did that. Okay, so if you're soldering tiny little pieces and you feel like the solder is just going all over the place, it's probably because you're not being very careful about your solder paste, okay? You're not being really neat about it. So a couple tips. One, if your solder paste is just flowing all over the place, all right, you might want to just let it dry. Just let it sit there, give it a little bit of heat, just let it sit for a minute and, dry up just a little bit by just giving it a little extra, just a little bit of heat to sit, okay? And then come back and solder it. Another thing too is if it's going all over the place, you're using too much solder, typically is the problem. So you want to use less solder. And if you're doing really, really tiny places, like tiny little chains, and it's going all over the place, consider pick soldering it or using a small chip instead of paste, because paste does seem to get a little tiny bit sloppy. And it makes you feel any better, okay, if anyone out there is trying to solder box chain, that's, believe it or not, it is considered a master skill, okay? If you're trying to get your master bench jeweler certificate, that's one of the things that you are required to do, and it takes quite a bit of skill to do that. So don't beat yourself up over it. Another thing too is you're going to need to get into like a tiny little torch like this to be able to even solder a box chain. So that's, give yourself a little bit of margin for error there. Okay. Did I mention? Yeah. Okay. So if solder has failed, another thing that I see people doing a lot is that they keep adding more solder. You do not need to keep adding more solder when you can see that the solder is sitting there. So earlier I pulled this piece apart, right? Idealistically, there should be solder already there to get this to come back together. So I'm going to make a little assumption that there is. I can see that the solder has moved out a little bit, spread out a little bit, but I'm going to go ahead and pickle this and we're going to try soldering it again. See what happens, okay? So for everybody who's on Twitch, I will put all the links for all the items that I'm using today. I will put that up after we are done here. Okay, so I am pickling that ring again, and then I'm going to show you how to solder it back without adding any extra solder. Because remember, the less solder you use, the neater it will be. So I'm looking at this piece. This is the spring ring sample that I made a couple of weeks ago. What if you want to take this apart? Because I would take this apart and use the wire for demoing, because I am that kind of girl. While we're sitting here pickling, I'll go ahead and see if I can pull it apart. So I'm going to add some flux, be really generous with it, and heat it up. See if I can pull it apart. But this is how you pull things apart, okay? Because maybe you don't like the way it's soldered together. Heating it. Look at that. And see, this is what happens if you're too aggressive. One of them broke. I know that this piece was way tormented when we were doing this, when I was sampling this a couple weeks ago. So it didn't surprise me that it breaks apart. Look at that. So that's how we pull it apart. So I'm just looking for flow, and I'm pushing it right when it flows and pulling the piece apart. But you can definitely do this, but buyer beware, you might end up with something like this, with these broken pieces, okay? So, there we go. And I'm gonna pull this quickly apart. Okay, so actually this piece is a really great piece to also illustrate the point. that this is sort of what happens when you overheat things, is your metal gets brittle and it will break apart. But see, all these pieces have solder on it, right? I'm going to solder them back together without applying more solder. I can see that there's solder all over this piece. So why not just, okay, so I'm quenching on the side here. Doesn't even look like it needs pickle. So I'm going to add some Flux on here and just stack it right on. I'll bet you I can get this to flow again. Why am I being so neat about this? This is a sample. Huh. Okay. So I'm going to heat it, and I'm going to look for flow just the same as I did before. Okay? As I'm pulling it apart, or as I'm putting it together. Okay, heating it. If your solder has dissipated too much, it's not going to come together because it's gotten away from where you want it to be. There's no bulk left for it to happen. The kind of flux I'm using is it's just green. What do we call this? Green flux. I'm sorry. It's Acuflux. I'm sorry. Okay, so look at that. It's together. There you go. Yep, it's together. So all I did there was I made the existing solder flow. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and pull that jump ring out and I'll show you how to do the jump ring again. So here, you may or may not be able to see it, but there is a teeny weeny bit of solder on there. I'm going to show you there, and I'm going to show you guys there. Okay, there is just a itty bitty bit. I'm going to put some flux on it, and sometimes you can get the solder to move. So if maybe you have solder on the right side and there's no solder on the left side, you're going to heat more on that left side and see if you can get it to move over towards the joint. How do you keep your what? Oh, your third hand, the helping hand tool. How do you keep it from getting bendy and wonky? Honestly, it's the nature of what it is. I don't have a trick for that one at all. They're fairly inexpensive tools, and that's part of it. If you're having things like the third hand, these are replaceable. I just buy a dozen of them at the dime store or the dollar store and use them. Even though these are titanium, notice what's happened, but sometimes these bends are to my advantage. As far as the fire tweezers, like here, you'll see I have a bend in the fire tweezers. I'll just take a pair of pliers and bend that back. But over time, they do deteriorate and you'll have to replace them. Okay, so there was flux on there. And I'm just going to heat this. Again, heat the whole thing and heat the joint. Just keep watching it until you see the solder flow. Oh yeah, look at that. Ooh, yeah. Okay. So yep, the solder flowed right back in there. And quench it. Look at that. See, I didn't even have to add more solder. There was so little that my eye could see, but I knew that there was solder there. Just reheat it, add a little flux, and it's good to go. All right. So what else do you have for questions? I think I addressed everything I wanted to address today. I'm looking at my list here. So a question that's come up, I'm going to change out here real quick the camera. Dope. Okay, I'm gonna switch out the other camera. I'm sorry, honey. Okay. Okay, so something that came up yesterday, we were talking, it's been a point of discussion a whole bunch of times regarding pickle and the disposal of pickle. So I'm going to bring it up again, and and there's I posted a blog on it a couple of months ago, and I noticed it's gone, so I added it back yesterday. But how to dispose of pickle? There seems to be some dispute. If there's some dispute on how to dispose of it, okay? And when I talk about pickle, I'm talking about Sparex in particular. That's what I use here. There's some contention about using Sparex because people say it's not natural, okay, and it's bad for the environment. Bottom line is it is an acid, right? So if you're using vinegar and salt, I still contend that you have environmental hazards there too, in that if you're using vinegar and salt, you're using quite a bit of it. And if you're doing this a lot, then you're using many gallons of vinegar a year. So what's the problem with using the vinegar? It's still an acid, and over time, it's about volume. Your volume will catch up to my 2 cups of Sparex that I have here at some point. The other thing too is the plastic, okay? You're using a gallon of vinegar once a week if you're doing this a lot, or once a month. If you're doing it once a month even, that's 12 1-gallon plastic jugs that you're putting into the environment. And yeah, you can say that you're recycling, but you know, the first step in the recycling triangle is to reduce. So you want to reduce your consumption, right? So the plastic is a bad thing. All right. So that's my contention between going natural and with Sparex. It's a give and take here. If you're using your pickle properly, you're not disposing it all the time. You know, you're not using it or you're not disposing it all the time. You should be having this for years on end if you are treating your pickle correctly. If you're not taking someone's advice and putting peroxide in it or putting iron in it to do your reverse, whatever you call that, to remove the iron oxides, whatever. Anyway, if you're not doing any of that, you should have that same container of pickle for years. Therefore, your consumption is really low. Okay. Now, if you want to dispose of it, that was the question that I was talking to. And I talked to the manufacturer directly yesterday about this. How do you dispose of this? Okay. And a lot of people, what I've heard is, oh no, you can't dump this, it's really bad. I'm like, well, if you neutralize it, it becomes a different thing, doesn't it? It's neutral. So how do you neutralize it? You neutralize it with baking soda. You put baking soda into it until it's no longer reactive, right? But then what do you do with that when you're done? You know what? Best advice is always with things that you don't know how to dispose of is you take it to hazardous waste. But what you can do is after you've neutralized it, you put it in the trash. Done. It's over, right? Because it's neutral. But then the argument came that what about the copper residue that's inside of there? I've heard that, oh, you know, it is hazardous and it's bad for amphibians or whatever, the wildlife. Sigh. Big sigh. The thing is that when we go to remove the lime or the clogs in our pipes, believe it or not, you're using more than the 2 cups of pickle residue that you have. What are we calling it? Copper sulfite that is in your pickle. You're putting down more down your drain than you are when you're disposing your pickle. So that's sort of, you know, something that you want to consider. But my argument is how many people out there are actually saving their copper shavings, okay, instead of just putting it into the trash? How many people are actually recycling that? Most people look at copper and go, oh, it's so cheap. They throw it in the trash and walk away. Isn't that the same thing as when you neutralize pickle and dispose of it? It's basically copper shavings. As far as the acid, again, you've neutralized it. Anyway, so that's my rant for the day. And, you know, if you have any questions, I did post that up on the website or on the qfarmgray.com website so you can read about it and understand it. I know there's a lot of stuff on the internet, and frankly, this isn't my opinion. I called the manufacturer and I talked to them in detail about it, and, you know, was educated. So educate yourself, understand the science, and make a decision on how you want to proceed. Okay, so I did see here that Yvonne asked if I've ever used Cupronil. You know, frankly, no, I've never used Cupronil, but it is something that's very viable. A lot of people use it. From what I understand too, is sort of interesting, is that you can use it for steel, but I have to do some research on that. But I do understand that Cupronil is, it's a flux, and it's a really nice flux that it reduces fire scale, okay? And it's a liquid, but outside of that, don't know anything about it. I just do know that people who use it love it, okay? So any other questions for me? Okay, so I had a question from Twitch. How do you subscribe on Twitch through Prime? You go to twitchprime.com. As soon as you go there, it's a really simple click, right? Once you get there, and it will connect your Amazon Prime to Twitch. And then once you're connected, if you go to my my channel, there's a big purple button on top that says subscribe. Click that, and then it's done. Thanks for asking. Anyway, that's all I've got today. It is a beautiful day outside. It seems like it's beautiful for a lot of people out there. So go out there and enjoy it. Send me questions if you have it. I'll try to answer as quickly as we can. And I'm going to post the links up as soon as we're done on Twitch. So if, the rest of the week, Friday, we are part 2 of the Outsider Pendant. You can still jump in on that if you want to catch the Zoom. The recordings will be there for you if you want to watch it later, if you missed last week. And you can register through that on the Urban Beater website. Next Monday, we're going to be back here again for the Minimal Metal Monday. And we're doing the Kridhe pendant, which is basically a Celtic knot. And then on Wednesday, for the first time, we are doing the step-by-step surprise. Kits are going out either today or tomorrow. So if you haven't ordered your kit yet, you can still order your kit, but it is a surprise project, and we are just going to step through it, and at the end you'll get a surprise. Anyway, and next week, for all the beginners out there, if you are still struggling with soldering and want to get a formal step-by-step on how to do it, we're doing a one session Zoom on basic soldering next Friday. It's going to be the spiral chain. So again, you can register for that. If you are looking for a kit, you'll want to register soon if you want to get it in time by next Friday. Okay? The schedule, I did have a schedule posted on, I do have a schedule posted on the Q Talk page, and so you can look at it for the next 4 or 5 weeks. It's scheduled all the way out, so you don't have to keep guessing and waiting and seeing what's going on, but you can definitely reach out to me if there's any questions on specific projects that I have coming up. That's it for me today. I'm going to go out and enjoy the weather and try to get some packages out. Maybe UPS has delivered today and I can finish putting together your kits. All right. Thanks so much for being here. Thanks for your support. It's been great. It's pretty exciting stuff, and we're moving forward. All right. Have a great day. We'll see you on Friday Zoom, if not Monday. Bye.